It is my pleasure to welcome you both in the room. We have our students, grazie, arrivederci, our master students here of Greek History 1. It is my pleasure to welcome our guests online on behalf of our FeBo team. This is our 9th FeBinar, the talks organized in the framework of our ERC project, FeBo, here in Trento. The FeBinars are a kind of think tank of this project, as our guests already know, at least the one online. Our aim is to investigate the complexity of the dynamics affecting the internal and external border areas of Greek federal states. Our focus is on a big question. How can border wars be avoided, and how can federalization processes, aggregative federalization processes, contribute to this? And as a consequence, we need to work on hot topics in the current debate, such as the linearity of borders, porosity of borders, capacity of COINA to implement border management policies, so top-down, but also border management cultures, that is bottom-up, the relevance of cross-border activities, balances of power. The literature on these topics is already enormous and in a state of flux. And for this reason, we have invited and will be inviting in the next 2 years experts on these topics. By me, I intend Claudio Biagetti, Rebecca Massinelli, Sebastian Scharf, Roy van Wyk, and me, the FeBo team. Since intra-federal and extra-federal borders must necessarily be approached from various research perspectives and with different questions, we organized 2 distinct series of FeBinars, each with another focus, one on internal borders, the management of internal borders by federal states. This is the title of this FeBinar series. The other on external borders, crossing federal borders, ancient and modern. Both series have been initiated by the inaugural lecture delivered by Hans Beck, Münster, on March the 7th, which focused on a case study involving both intra-federal and extra-federal borders. In the framework of our ERC project, this FeBinar is the 5th one of the FeBinar series, the management of internal borders by federal states, which will run for 2 years, like the other one, and aims to analyze how Greek federal states dealt with the problem of internal, that is, intra-federal borders and border areas. Did border management policies aim at peaceful coexistence? To what extent were balance of power and stability an objective? This and other question we are asking presuppose other thorny issues. What borders are we talking about? The borders of polis, of districts, tele, between districts. What are the internal borders of federal states? And especially, what happens when a political community that has been engaged in border conflicts for centuries enters a koinon? How are its borders redefined, and which actors are involved in this redefinition? How much does it affect the internal balance of the political community itself and the internal balance of the koinon of which it is part? I met Clémence Weber-Pallez at a conference in Athens that she organized together with Stefano Frullini and Eva Moans, and I immediately came to appreciate the rigorous yet brilliant approach of this scholar, with whom I discovered we have many interests in common. Firstly, borders, and secondly, Argos. Argos has been engaged in conflicts with neighboring and less neighboring communities for centuries, and in many cases, these are border conflicts. In the Hellenistic period, however, the issue becomes even more complex because first the Achaeans and then the Romans enter the scene. What happens to the border areas of Argos in this period? I look forward to hearing what Clémence Weber-Pallez has to tell us. Professor Weber-Pallez received her doctorate from the École Normale Supérieure in Lyon with a dissertation on the representation of space in Argos and in Argolis, which was judged by a jury composed of, among others, Denis Rousset, Nicolas Richet, Marcel Pierrat, Catherine Grandjean. And she was professor agrégée at the Collège Jean et Paul d'Aubaret de Saint-Genis Laval and is now maître de conférence in Toulouse. She's a member of the editorial board of the journal Monde Sociaux, vice president of the Association des membres and anciens membres de l'École française d'Athènes. She was referee for prestigious journals as Anabase, Pallas, and is co-editing with Stefano Frullini and Ivan Vance the volume Through the Argive Lens. She has studied and worked with Marcel Pierrat, Kyriakidis, Michel Kasevitz, Ariane Esposito, Ayrton Pollini, Stefania De Vido. And with the latter three scholars, she founded a research group, TEMAS, Territoire, Multiple Agentivité et Environnement Socio-Économique, with which FeBo has an ongoing philia and a scientific exchange. Besides, the next meeting will be in June in Mulhouse, and some FeBo members will also participate. So I am delighted to give her the floor to talk about these hot issues, what happened to the Argive borderlands during the Hellenistic and the Roman period. Clemence, floor is yours. Thank you for your passion.
Thank you very much, Elena. I will try to share my screen, but I can't, apparently. It says that I can't.
Poi la sentita abbastanza? Mica tanto. Proviamo. We cannot see your screen now. Are you sharing?
No, but I can share.
You can't share.
It's
Maybe
not possible.
Puoi nominarla Costa?
It's written in French that it's deactivated for me.
Now we are activating it. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I can.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
you can see it now. Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Great.
I'm trying to put it. Perfect. Okay, thank you very much. So first of all, I would like to extend my warmest thanks to the ERC FeBo team for their invitation, and especially to Elena and to Claudio. So as she told you, Elena and I have known each other for several years now, and it's always a pleasure to exchange with her about the Peloponnese and other matters. What I would like to present to you today is the results of a long-standing question I have had about the Argive territory. Indeed, during my thesis, I sought to understand the territorialities of the Argives in Antiquity, as Elena told you. Were they aware that they lived in a region that we, modern, call the Argolid? Did they attach any importance to the very idea of region? Or was it only their civic territories, the famous Kora, that mattered? Working on all these questions, I was naturally obliged to think about the limits of the Argives, the limits the Argives could set for their territories. So I embarked on this quest, which I warn you, is far from easy. Let me take you with me on this quest through 7 centuries, in order to better understand how borders change in the Hellenistic and imperial period, which will be my topic today. Of course, I was not the first one to take an interest in the question of borders in ancient Greece. We owe the first work on this subject to Giovanna da Verrocchi in 1988, Frontiera e confini della Grecia antiqua. She was the first to challenge the modern idea of a linear frontier and to question the vocabulary of antiquity with an hemic point of view. This is a seminal work, but it is also intended to be general in scope, thus creating boundary patterns for all the Greek cities, which can always be dangerous because it's very difficult, to perceive nuances and developments particularly at the local level. Following this seminal work, the Greek frontiers have never been the subject of a book of their own, but have been studied in parts, either according to one type of source, such as epigraphy with Denis Rousset, or in relation to another historical issue, such as extraterritorial fortification, as in the work of Josiah Ober of Sylvain Fachard. A number of symposia have recently been held, you can see that on the slide, on this subject, and I must, of course, mention the Mulhouse conference, which was the founding meeting of our TMIS group with Ariana Esposito, Stefania De Vido, and Ayrton Polini, and which, as Anna told you, is now FeBo friend. So, but as you can see on this slide, there is still not a huge interest in the question of borders in ancient Greece, especially for the Hellenistic and imperial periods. That is why the project ERC FeBo is so important for the future. So, what was the territory of Argos from classical to imperial times? The Argives occupied a political territory that they named, at least since the 5th century BC, Argeia. The first mention of this name appears on 6 bronze tablets dated between 575 and 550 BC, and it was found in the Argive area. That is so in the northeast of Argos, as you can see right now on the map. It threatens anyone attempting to materially destroy the support of this law with exile outside the, you can see, Gastas Argeias. Most scholars agree that it clearly refers to Argive territory, from which any offender will be excluded, also threatened by Hera's curse. In any case, it's the same expression that is later popularized in classical sources. To designate the territory of Argos, all authors use the ethnic Argeios, Argeia, Argeion, and Herodotus speaks, for example, of a territory of the Argive, et Argeion Kore. Nevertheless, the name of the territory stabilizes around the name et Argeia in Hellenikos of Lesbos and in Thucydides. For the former, the Argeia is the territory of the ancestral city of Argos, as you can see on the slide, which was divided into 3 parts by the descendants of the Argive king Vorenus. For Thucydides, it is the entire territory over which the Argives exercise sovereignty. The name Argeia was popularized in the 4th century, for example, by Xenophon and Aristotle, who defined it as a subdivision of Greece. However, the origin of the noun sometimes reappears as in the Weber-Pallez of the pseudo-Scylax, which speaks of e Argeia Koa. In all these expressions, the territory of Argos is indeed that over which the city has sovereign authority. It is limited in the literary sources by its proximity to other territories, as you can see on this map, Epidaurus and Crinoria for Thucydides, or Laconia and Epidaurus for the pseudo-Scylax. The civic territory of Argos is still called the Argeia in the Hellenistic period, for example, in Polybius. This is also the case in imperial times, in sources outside the city, like Strabon or Pausanias, who constantly use this term. So, what sources do we have in order to find the limit of this territory of the Argeia? To understand what constitutes a border or a borderland in Argos and elsewhere, in fact, and to avoid applying our own definition of the frontier to Antiquity, we need to search for the territorial markers used by the city, as well as attempts at circumcision by literary authors. There are some information scattered in literary sources, but as you will see, they have to be observed very carefully. First, in the literature, the Argeia is limited by natural barriers. For instance, rivers. 3 of them appear in the literary sources and act as Argive western border during the classical period. You can see here the Erazinos, I can show you, but you can see on the west, Erasinos, the Caradros, and on the south, the Tanaus. The same is true for the north with the Achelos. In these cases, the watercourse is special limit of citizen identity, which serves as a gateway to exit from the specific territory. In addition to these hydrographic indicators of Argive boundaries, the mountains also act as limits. In ancient representations, the Parthenian on the west and Coryphaean in the east separated Argeia from territories of Tegea and Epidaurus, respectively. Mount Parparus between Laconia and Argeia had the same purpose during all antiquity, according to Imperi and Byzantine sources. As you can see, in the literature, natural elements often overlap to define the same boundary of Argive territory. The border between Sparta and Argos can be a river, a mountain, and sometimes even an entire region, as for the Kynoria. These elements reinforce each other to create not strict, precise borders, but borderlands, in which the sovereignties of neighboring cities are diluted and merged. And to make the whole thing more complex, the same mountain can be used to designate two different civic borderlands, as for the Lycian or the Parthenian, which, depending on the author speaking, is Argive or Arcadian. These Argive borders, known from the literary sources, seem to be superimposable, and in this sense, the notion of borderland seems much more effective in the history of Greek territorial representation than simple borders. Still, we have to be careful. These different indications taken together can be misleading. The knowledge of Herodotus, Strabo, or Pausanias is a matter of scholarly geography. This geography may be inspired by local realities and Argive representations, but we cannot understand it directly as emanating from Argive mental maps. So, to find out how the Argives themselves represented their civic boundaries, we need to look at the artifacts they produce on their own, be they concrete achievements such as milestones, extra-urban sanctuaries or fortification, or epichoric literary production. Unfortunately, there are very few of these later sources, so we have to rely on landscape artifacts to find out how the Argive represented and organized the boundaries of their territory. So, what kind of artifacts are we speaking about to this history of borderlands? The most important, it's a map with the different borderlands Argos can have, I forgot about. So the most important kind of landmarks will be the so-called horoi, the boundary stones, which best match in our contemporary imagination a linear delimitation of the border. But as you can see on this slide, where I brought the references of all the Argive horoi I know about, there are three restrictions. First, there are very few of them. Secondly, a lot of them date back to the classical period. Last but not least, it's difficult to bound them to a clearly demarcated state border. Indeed, the majority of them, as you can see, are boundary stones used for sanctuaries, for example, the Horus for the 7 against 5, or for Zeus Apollos and Argos. You can see also Hera in Mycenae, or Apollon Pythias in Azim. The others are delimitation for some squares, as Epipola in Nemea, or fields, as for the Horus of the, I quote, duck field in Nauplia, which was the property of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So it's difficult, maybe impossible, to consider the discovered boundary stones as landmark for some frontier. Another territorial marker visible in the Argive landscape, I have the problem with my other computer, are very well studied as a fortification first, and were very well studied by Yannis Pikoulas in his book Odikos Diktioke Amina, Apotin Korinthos to Argos Kitin Arcadia in 1995. And now, very recently, by Anna Magdalena Blomley, who just published her PhD, A Landscape of Conflict, for the classical and Hellenistic periods. She stands up against the conclusions of Josiah Ober about 45 sites viewed as military strategic defensive networks. And she suggests that interpreting rural fortified structures solely as territorial defenses may be oversimplified, and that often rural fortification, initially linked to the fields, were used as a defense by the city only at some occasions. The third type of sources we can use to find the city borderlands are the so-called extra-urban sanctuaries. This qualification comes from the Polignac model, which François de Polignac developed in his book La Cité Grecque in 1983. Yes, you can see here the translation in English. In this model, certain sanctuaries were on purpose located near borderlands to mark the city's identity and thus the limits of its territory. By the way, François de Polignac used Argos as a typical example of his model, with one main center you can see on the map, the Irion in Prosimna in the Argive plain only for the archaic and classical period. As a matter of fact, the Polignac model has long been used only for these periods, but since for almost 10 years now, it also applies to the Hellenistic and Roman sanctuaries thanks to the work of Milena Melfi and Olympia Bopu, you can see on the screen. Then, as the splendid Kaya Harter Wibupu conference weeks ago demonstrated, one of our most precious sources for the reconstruction of borderlands are the inscribed arbitration between two cities. For the Peloponnese, most of these documents are from the Hellenistic period, and you can find all of them in this book based on Mrs. Harter Wibupu's thesis, Das zwischenstaatliche Schiedsverfahren im archaischen Koinon zu friedlichen Streitbeilegungs, nach den epigraphischen Quellen, published in 1995. In the case of Argos, we have found only 6 such arbitrations, although others are known by the literature. On this slide, you have a quick overview of the 6 of them. We will examine them during the presentation, but you can already see that in the 2 earliest, the city of Argos plays the role of judge between Knossos and Tilissos, and after between Kimolos and Melos, and that in the latest, the city is one of the parties whose territory is subjected to the judgment of a third party. Another way, and the last maybe, to understand Borderlands is to have a look at its administrative composition. Since the democratization of Argos in the 460s BC, the Argive citizen is always named by his komitik, an Argive equivalent of Attic demotic, that is to say, a territorial designation. Thus, each citizen comes from a komi, an administrative subdivision. And to know all of them, we now have, you can see here, an extraordinary source, which was discovered in 2000 in the center of Argos. Over 100 bronze plates contains the accounts of the treasure of Athena Palace of Argos. The discoverer, Chalampos Kritsas, was able to date them from the first third of the 4th century. It reveals a lot of cometics. You can see them here, that are not a lot of all of them, but some. As yet unpublished, this inscription will provide a global vision of the Argive territory through the accumulation of komi. We know that some of these komi were located on the edge of Argive territory. The accounts of Athena Palace, for example, contain cometics referring to Kynuria, so I told you the borderland between Sparta and Argos. More precisely, the Phreatis. Another example is the city of Cleona, you can see in the north, between Argos and Corinth, which was previously the organizing city of the Nemean Games. We have little information of this komi for the Hellenistic period. Two inscriptions for Mycenae around 200 BC, however, hint a very autonomous operation with diplomatic relations and festivals specific to the commune. And we have almost no information at all for the imperial period. It really is something we should work about in the future. So, no, that we have overlooked everything we know about what might have served as boundaries for the Argive in ancient times. Let's take a step-by-step look at the evolution of these boundaries in order to answer three questions. Firstly, can we define some borderlands for the city of Argos during the Hellenistic and imperial period? Something simple but necessary. Secondly, how do these borderlands evolve over time in these periods? Can we observe some territorial paradigm changes? Thirdly, what can the borderlands teach us about the more general history of Peloponnesian cities in the face of external domination, Macedonian and then Roman? As Strabo said, you can see that on the slide, Argos was all this time always under the exousia, the rulership of someone else. And finally, and of greatest interest to the ERC FeBo group, what impacts did adherence to federalism have on the Argive borderlands? We will see three sorts of federalism. The Hellenic League of Philip II, the Achaean Koinon, and the Roman Pan-Achaean Koinon, and we will try to look for differences and similarities in the treatment of borderland in this free federal context. So the period we will study starts with the very nice and very rare documents, which will show us the importance of the borderlands for the Argives in the 4th century BC. This inscription was found reused in the Agora of Argos and lists a series of natural and fortified points for what seems to be a territorial delimitation. There are lots of debates about its date, about which region it involved, maybe Arcadia and Argeia, but I will not bother you with these arguments right now. Anyway, it provides us with an overview of the marker that served as boundaries in the events of political or economic conflicts at the end of the classical era or in the beginning of the Hellenistic one. We find the name, you can see maybe on the slide, of roads, of sanctuaries, of localities, and above all of orus and horus, the former being fortification, the later milestones, probably private ones. So we are now sure that our overview of the territorial markers was right, and that in the beginning of the Hellenistic period, the Argives had big interest in their borderlands. Let's see now what happened next. As early as the 340s, the Argives are Philip's allies. They erect statues of him, and Philip readily repeats that he is the descendant of the Argive king Temenos, and that Argos is his homeland. A pro-Macedonian political faction seems to have taken power in Argos, represented by Nazias, Myrtes, and Teledamus, if we believe Demosthenes. Nazias will have remained in power in the Argive city at least until 337 BC. After his victory in Caronia, and probably after his invasion of the Peloponnese to counter Sparta, Philip created the Hellenic League of Corinth, to be exact, the Synedrion of the Greeks, to Synedriou ton Elanon. We have very, very few sources concerning this league. Perhaps it's the chance of discovery, but of the very few inscriptions that have come down to us, two concerns Argos. One inscription you can see here, found in Smyrna, but originating from Chimelos, refers to an arbitration by the Argive people in a territorial dispute between the two islands of Melos and Chimelos, I quote, in accordance with the resolution of the Synedrion of the Hellenes. So, katata dokema to Synedriou ton Elanon. It has therefore been dated to the years 337, 336. Secondly, it was in Argos that a decree for a common peace was found, with Geoffrey Rupp recently attributed to the Corinthian League. The last lines are often totally forgotten. You can see here, I had to put them in commentaries, but they refer to a territorial arbitration that is likely to concern the borderlands between Argos and one of its neighbors, probably Sparta. In a context where the Macedonian king greatly favored his home city. So it is clear that the Synhedrion of the Greeks under Philip acted as the tribunal for border disputes. Aristotle tells us that Philip would have imposed a territorial division in the Peloponnese. As can be seen on this slide, Philip's territorial judgment, in reality probably that of the Synhedrion, was used several times during the Hellenistic period in border disputes between Messene, Sparta, and Megalopolis. The referent is always the same, the myth of the return of the Heraclides, who divided the Peloponnese into three parts, Argos, Messene, and Sparta. I have shown elsewhere that this myth is born in Argos and was the subject of a diplomatic discourse that the Argive constantly repeated throughout Antiquity. This myth gave the Argive a third of the Peloponnese, which obviously they didn't actually possess. They negotiated with Philip, who agreed to respect his ancient myth by giving Argos territories taken from the Spartan or from the inhabitants of the Argolid. Pausanias confirms these facts. Speaking of an Argive borderland, which he keeps anonymous, but which will have been disputed from immemorial times, he specifies that it was attributed by Philip II to Argos. This is probably the Kinuria. Moreover, Troezen came under Argive control under circumstances that are hard to define. Nazias, the Argive ruler we have already mentioned, is said to have, I quote, established the power of the Athenian Athenogenes on Troezen, this Athenian who had prostrated himself before him. According to Hyperides, the citizens of Troezen were then exiled and found Asaleum in Athens. Troezen probably became an Argive satellite at the time of Philip's partition and perhaps remained so for several years. We now know that Epidaurus was also under the rule of Argos in the 330s. The so-called Stele of the Punishment, edited by Chalampos Kritsas Estebaten Sprignitz, and the Proxeni decree for Menecleos of Phlius, discovered in the sanctuary of Asclepius in Epidaurus, are both of Argive manufacture and show that the Argives were then managing the sanctuary. So the creation of the Synhedrion, therefore, enabled Philip to arbitrate Peloponnesian border disputes to the benefit of the Argives. The truth is, the situation has not lasted for more than a decade. Epidaurus became independent again shortly afterwards. So it is clear that at the beginning of the Hellenistic period, the Argives not only integrated borderlands into their political system and into their representation, they made of the city, but they tried to push the boundary as far as they can, and it was part of a big territorial claim on the northeast Peloponnese. So what after the end of this league? Identifying Hellenistic frontier presents a number of difficulties. Literary sources are almost non-existent. Polybius is an exception, but mention of the Argive borderlands are very, very rare. So what about fortification? Anna Magdalena Blomley suggests that they can be used to better understand civic territories, as in this map for the with the fortification in the territory of Argos, you can see here. According to her, the distribution of these sites demonstrates that during the 4th, the 3rd, and the 2nd centuries BC, Argos not only controlled the Argive plain, but also the eastern foothills of the Artemisian and Parthenian mountains, certain areas in Kinuria, and the western part of the valley between the Argive and the Saronic Gulf. But she admits it herself. It is very difficult to date these fortifications and to know their occupation over the long term. So it's a tricky way to observe the borderlands. What about the horror? We don't have any of them, and we have only 2 inscriptions that seems to be Argive border dispute, as I've shown you. But we shall see how difficult their interpretation is. So is there any hope of rediscovering the boundaries of the territories of Argos in the Hellenistic period, and above all, the importance that the Argives attach to these areas? Today, I would like to propose a new approach, the study of the so-called extra-urban sanctuaries during the Hellenistic and imperial period as a way to understand the relationship between the Argive and their borderlands. By studying the investment made by the Argive in 2 of their extra-urban sanctuaries, the sanctuary of Zeus at Nemea and that of the Arion at Prosimna, we can trace Argive concern about the borderlands. We will also use information about other extra-urban sanctuaries, but as you will see, there are a few of them only, which are known thanks to the excavation for these periods. So, at Nemea, the sanctuary of Zeus was partially refurbished in the last quarter of the 4th century as part of a major architectural program. The surrounding wall, the Aeron, and the altar of Zeus were rebuilt. Similarly, various structures located between the Xenon and the temple, the so-called Oka, you can see number 3, underwent renovations. The program is also included the program also included the monumentalization of the sanctuary. A new temple of Zeus was erected, for example. A Xenon, that is to say, a building for athletes, also bath and a stadium were built. The sanctuary of Zeus at Nemea remained prosperous in the first third of the 3rd century BC. A monumental altar with low triglyphs was erected. The Aeron of Opheltes, the hero of Opheltes, was restored, and numerous ties stamped with the name of the people of Argos or of Nemean Zeus or of Argive entrepreneurs prove the scale of the work. The Argives were totally involved in the functioning of the sanctuary. A new diplomatic status was developing in Argos and will become ubiquitous in Hellenistic epigraphic documentation. The Thearodokia around the cult of Zeus in Nemea, to Dios to Nemeai, and Hera Argea. The list of Theorodokoi found in the century give an account of the extent of those Argive networks, from Macedonia to Cyprus, via Acarnania or the Ionian Islands. They bear witness to the central role played by the sanctuary in the staging of diplomatic relations in Argos. The sanctuary of Hera at Prosimna underwent its major development phase at the beginning of the 1st century BC. Excavators, both American and French, I have to admit, were sadly not interested at all in its activity during the Hellenistic and imperial periods, which makes our task more difficult. However, there are a few clues that the site was still active in the late 4th and early 3rd century BC. The base of a statue dedicated by the king Nicocreon of Salamis in the last third of the 4th century BC has been found in situ. The king described Argos as his metropolis and records that the Argives honored him for having offered bronze for the festival of Hera. So these 2 sanctuaries and the area they occupied were therefore marked by a strong Argive identity recognized by the whole community in the Mediterranean world. The Argive invested in them by worshipping, by carrying out renovation and new construction they financed, and in political terms by making them the brand image of the city of Argos. While the game of Zeus was prestigious because they were pan-Hellenic, the contests of Hera forged a network of kinship between Argos, the metropolis, and the people who took part of the Argive identity, whether Macedonians, Italians, or Cypriots. This attention paid by the Argive to their extra-urban sanctuary gives rise to the representation of a polycentric civic and cultic territory. Several decrees were found in the city as well in Nemea and other cities and mention a common and concomitant display as a urban sanctuary of Apollon Lycaeus on the Agora of Argos, at the Eraion, and in Nemea. These places of worship confirm the Argives' interest in their extra-urban areas and more specifically, their borderlands with Sicyon, Chios, and Corinth. This interest can also be seen in the defensive construction they built there. The city was thus conceived as polycentric, with the urban center grouping together local and regional functions, and the sanctuaries performing diplomatic functions on a wider scale. The surveys confirms the development of the extra-urban Argive areas, let's say borderlands areas. In the Weber-Pallez Valley, for example, the increasing number of agricultural sites may be connected to the resettlement of Mycenae around 300 BC, as the excavation have shown. The small town of Azini, south of present-day Toulouse, had been partly abandoned in the Archaic and Classical period, perhaps following its destruction by the Argives, but it's reoccupied around 300 BC, as evidenced by the large Hellenistic necropolis excavated nearby. Tiles from the Hellenistic period are stamped with the name of an Argive Agoranomus. Some of them were found near the temple of Apollon, on the upper terrace of Barbuna Hill, which suggests that the sanctuary of Apollon was still the object of a worship in the Hellenistic period. It owned lands in the surrounding areas, particularly on the area so to side, that is to say the borderland between Epidaurus and Hermione and Argos. A boundary stone from the end of the 4th century BC thus bore the inscription you can see here, Oros Putedos. Everything changed in the 280s, a period of turmoil for the city. After the Battle of Argos between Pyrrhus and Antigonus Gonatas in 272 BC, Aristippus, the Argive supporter of the Macedonian king, took the power in Argos. From then on, an autocratic power was established, described as a tyranny by ancient sources. Aristippus' family remained in power until 229 BC, when Argos became part of the Achaean Koinon. At the same time, there was a shift in the territorial paradigm, particularly in regard to the role of these sanctuaries. Excavation at Nemea and Prosina reveal a major break in the Argives' involvement in the Eraion and in the sanctuary of Zeus. Both sites were deserted. Attendance at the sanctuary at Nemea fell sharply in the second half of the 3rd century BC. Similarly, the terrace of the Eraion ceased to be used. Also in the 3rd century, at a time that cannot be precisely determined, the threefold erection of stelae bearing the city's decision ceased. Only the sanctuary of Apollon Lycaeus remained a place of display. Nemea and the Eraion are no longer mentioned. The reason is apparently very simple. Before 240 BC, the Nemea games, and probably those of Era, were transferred to the town of Argos itself. Archaeological evidence suggests that this move took place in the 2nd quarter of the century. The Argive authority hastily, I quote Jean-Charles Moretti, built a large theater in the city to accommodate spectators at the musical competition and perhaps a stadium for sporting events. The cult statue, sculpted by Lysippus, was moved from Nemea to Argos. At the same time, the sanctuary of Zeus fell into disuse. In the case of the Eraion, The research into the Hellenistic period, I told you, has been more neglected, and it is now impossible to date the transfer of the Iraq games to Argos with any accuracy. Nevertheless, local sources indicate that the ancient Hecatomboia took the name of Eraia during the 3rd century BC. The Mycenae-Prosymna area was too gradually deserted from a cultic point of view. Activity at the sanctuary of Enalios in Mycenae also ceased in the 3rd century BC. By the end of the same century, Mycenae was no more than a branch of Argive territory and seemed to be left to its own devices. The abandonment of extra-urban sanctuaries in favor of the urban center was therefore probably the work of the new tyrants of Argos, of new representation, perhaps new needs. The question is then, why the games were brought back to the city center? The reason seems to have been financial and security related. The games were moved because the borderlands of Argos were no longer safe in the 3rd century BC, which would have forced the tyrants to invest heavily in their defenses. The restoration of the Achaean koinon and his aggressiveness in the middle of the 3rd century BC are probably the reason for such a policy. The capture of Cleonae by Aratos in 235 BC is proof enough of this. You can see that on this slide. The Achaean strategos decided to organize the Nemean games by his own, openly challenging those organized by the Argive in their own city. Aratos' games were certainly held at the sanctuary of Nemea itself. Excavations have revealed a few restorations from this period, but they do not allow to return to the heyday of the sanctuary at the end of the 4th century BC. The buildings fell into ruin over the following decades. The sanctuary of Nemea, situated at the crossroads of the territories of Sicyon, Corinth, Piraeus, and Argos, had become easy prey for the Achaeans. An inscription discovered in Nemea in the 20s bears witness of a conflict between the cities of Cleonae and Argos. The name of the tyrant Aristomachus who appears on it and the study on the writing have made it possible to date it to the 2nd half of the 3rd century. Dicasterian, a court, periagesis, a spatial demarcation, and a possible find are mentioned. The text, unfortunately very fragmentary, as you can see here, has been interpreted as an agreement made at the time of the Argives' entry into the Achaean koinon to settle disputes between the two cities, in particular around the land of the sanctuary of Zeus. For some scholars, the dispute was over control of the valley north of present-day Dervenakia on the road between Mycenae and Cleonae. Other scholars prefer to see it as an agreement over the organization of the competition. Anyway, it is easy to see why the Argives wanted to hold their pan-Hellenic games in the safety of the city walls, rather than risk having them monopolized by others if organizing them in a dispute area. As Anna Magdalena Blomley wrote, the area is then a, I quote, land of conflicts. She noticed that a tower cluster was built in the north of the Argive plain, a few miles south of Cleonae. It is tempting to see the construction of rural fortification in this area as an Argive response to political insecurity or instability in the 3rd century or around 235 BC, when Argos lost control of Cleonae and came under increasing pressure from the Achaean League. Now, what is to say about another region, about the Kinuria during the 3rd century BC? First, we don't know what happened to this region after Philip's decision. We have very little information about the dominant city. We know that around 275 BC, the inhabitants of Tyros, number 83 on the map, the Teritai, called themselves Come of Lacedaemon, Coma Lacedaemonian Telidae, in one of their offerings to Delphi. An horary inscription, which is dated before 222, tells us that Argos had a come named Zarax, which will mean that Argia then extended over all of Caenoria. This agrees with the text of Polybius, who tells us that in 219, Lycurgus, the Spartan Lycurgus, took some Argive places as Zarax, as you can see on the slide. After the defeat of the Lacedaemonians at Sellasia in 222 against the Macedonians and the Achaeans, the Lacedaemonians lost territories. The Egyptes, the Belminates, and probably Caenoria. We can perhaps conclude, while awaiting other results, that Caenoria had returned to Sparta at the end of the 4th century, or in the beginning of the 3rd century, let's say, but that Argos took advantage of the slightest possibilities to reconquer this region, which explains the establishment at the beginning of the century of an entire network of Argive fortress, you can see on the map. So if we gather all the data, it seems that the northern borderlands of Argos were abandoned more or less voluntarily by the Argive in the first half of the 3rd century, while Caenoria, recaptured by the Argive at an uncertain date, was forcibly taken from them by the Spartans in the second half of the 3rd century. In all cases, the consequence is the same: an Argive withdrawal from the borderlands and a refocusing of power, cults, and economy in the town of Argos itself. We can see the same phenomenon elsewhere in the Argive borderlands. As for the structure built near Lissa on a pass between two peaks of Arachnean, ancient names of the mountain range which separates Argeia from Epidaurus. It was quickly identified with the altars of Zeus and Hera mentioned there by Pausanias. The systematic exploration of David Rupp in the 70s made it possible to provide a chronology of the occupation of this sanctuary. If a cult is very attested by the shards in the archaic and classical and imperial periods, the sanctuary seems abandoned at the Hellenistic time. No vestige or material from this period is in fact attested. This desertion of a sanctuary between Epidaurus and Argos is not surprising in the context of abandonment of borderlands in the face of the insecurity of the Hellenistic era and the withdrawal of cities towards the center. In 229, Argos, more precisely, its tyrant Aristomachus, joined the Achaean koinon after repeated attacks and following the death of the Macedonian king Demetrius II. From this time onwards, the Argives played a major role in this confederation. But sadly, we know almost nothing about what happened to the borderlands of Argos from these times onwards until the arrival of Rome. It is certain, however, that these areas continued to be at risk, particularly with the expansion of Sparta. During the so-called Cleomenes War, the Spartan king invaded the Argive borderlands, defended by the former tyrant Aristomachus on behalf of the Achaeans. As early as 225, Cleomenes entered the city with his army. At the beginning of the 2nd century BC, it was the turn of the Spartan tyrant Nabis to threaten the integrity of Argive territory, which he occupied and from which he siphoned off revenues. The small coastal settlements of the Argolic Gulf, and more specifically the cities of Caenoria, saw their ships arbitrarily added to the Lacedaemonian navy. In 205 BC, the Achaean strategos Philopoemen attended the Nemea and honored the Argives with a military parade through the city. All the Achaean meetings that took place in Argos, and there were a lot of them, or in the Argive territory, demonstrate that the question of the Argive borderlands was a matter for all the Achaeans in order to stop the Spartan hegemony. hegemony. The arrival of the Romans in Greece during the Second Macedonian War apparently did not change these territorial policies. Mycenae is an eloquent example of what happened to these extra-urban sites at the beginning of the 2nd century BC. In the spring of 197 BC, the Spartan nabis betrayed Philip V by approaching Flamininus and Attalus, announcing that, and I quote, "Argos is in my possession." It was then decided that the protagonists should meet in Mycenae. Nicostratus, strategos of the Achaean, also took part in the meeting. The location was symbolic, as it allowed Attalus and Flamininus to show their superiority over the Spartan by refusing to meet him in Argos itself, which was under Nabis domination. Mycenae thus seems to be more or less a free electron. A few years later, the Comte of Mycenae published various honorary decrees, you can see one here, for Protimos of Gortyn, to thank him for having helped the Mycenaean Hephaestus kidnapped by Nabis. These decisions were taken by the Cometes, who offered the Evergetes Proedia to the local Dionysia. It is tempting, when comparing with the text of Titus Livius with his epigraphic sources, to see here a pyramidal management of Argive affairs. The authorities of Argos delegated many politic and cultic affairs to the Comai or to the Koina, which were endowed with a great deal of independence. As early as the 230 BC, a koinon of the Asinean is also attested, you can see here. It honors the family of the Argive tyrants. So, until the middle of the 2nd century BC, the ancient borderlands of Argos and the sanctuaries located there remained peripheral to the Argive territory, whose model had become monocentric. After the destruction of Corinth in 146 BC, which marks the end of the war between the Achaeans and Rome, the victorious Lucius Mummius had the difficult mission, I have to say, to organize Greece, in order, of course, to define tax districts. He first had to work on the territorial division of the future province. Numerous border regulation records the decision taken by the general in favor of that Peloponnesian city. The Argives, who do not appear to have taken part in the Achaean War, were rewarded for their support in this way, as some unpublished inscriptions show us. Very interesting unpublished inscriptions. In this context, a badly mutilated inscription discovered in the Xenon at Nemea mentioned an arbitration by the general, you can see here, whose decision was repeated in the 1st century BC when the stele was engraved. According to its first editor, Donald Bradin, Lucius Mummius allowed the return of the Nemean games to Nemea itself under Argive control. However, archaeologists completely reject the idea that the sanctuary of Nemea was the center of the disputes, which had been concluded from the mention, you can see here on the line 6, to and Nemeae. For the archaeologists, it will be a part of the expression Theodocus to Zeus to and Nemeae ke tes eras tis argeas. So, what's more, excavation at Nemea have revealed that in the second half of the 2nd century BC, activity as a sanctuary has almost non-existent. Which means that the idea of a revival of Nemea thanks to Mummius can be rejected. In literary texts, Nemea is the only pan-Hellenic sanctuary not mentioned in the restoration program undertaken by the Roman general. How then can we explain the presence of this stele in Nemea itself? It should seem that the Argives wanted to mark their possession in this area. If the celebration of the games of Nemean Zeus did indeed take place in Argos, in the town of Argos itself, The revenues from the lands belonging to this god and located around the sanctuary of Nemea must have gone to the Argive city. In this sense, the sanctuary of Nemea and the Araion remain in Argos orbits, even though the games were no longer held there. On the one hand, for the land they possessed, and on the other, for the ancestral prestige they conferred on the city of Argos. The importance of these sacred lands to the city and its challenge of preserving them are illustrated in an Argive inscription for the late Hellenistic period. I can show you because it is unpublished, which honors a citizen charged with recovering sacred and public lands usurped by private individuals. The inscription names the lands of Hera, Heracles, Pythias, and Alectrian. This reorganization of the city's territorial management was a solution adopted by the Argives after a period of neglect of sacred and public extra-urban space. These lands are probably to be found around Prosimna, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Azini. Although they had become peripheral to the city, the sanctuary of Nemea and the Araion were not completely abandoned to their fate due to the economic benefit that the lands brought to the city, but also because of the ancestral prestige that they represented for the Argive community. The sanctuary of Nemea continued to receive offerings, such as the weapons dedicated by Mithridates VI, probably around 100 BC. The need for legitimacy on the part of certain Mediterranean rulers led them to include them in the traditional cultural landscape of Greek cities. A bronze weight from the 2nd century BC has also been found at Nemea. It was inscribed with the name of the Argive demos, proof of the city constant, albeit very small, investment in the sanctuary. The Araion was also used as a repository for the city's emancipation contracts, which were concluded under the authority of the Hieramnemones of Hera, who may have acted both in the city, in the town, and in the sanctuary. So, as in the 3rd century, however, the Argive were unable to guarantee the security of extra-urban areas, particularly in the face of the numerous acts of piracy that occurred in the region. In 67, Pompey had to intervene against pirates, who did not hesitate to desecrate Peloponnesian sanctuaries such as that of Hera in Argos. This is why, throughout this period, the Argive continued to celebrate the games of Hera and Zeus within their walls and to use them as a showcase to foreigners. In the first half of the 2nd century BC, they appointed, for example, the greatest political leaders from Philip V of Macedon to Flamininus as Agonatetes. Ancient sanctuary remained of very marginal use, especially as peripheries associated with an ancient heritage. It was this aspect that the Principate was to exacerbate by offering a new territorial paradigm to the city of Argos. Again, sorry about it, but we know almost nothing about the future of the Argive borderlands during the imperial era, in particular because 2 new phenomenons appeared, the Pax Romana and that of multiple identities, which means that an Argive can also be a Roman citizen or a Spartan or an Epidaurian. Borders are somewhat diluted in these identities, and in the case of Argos, border conflicts seems reduced to nothing. Once again, only extra-urban sanctuaries can bear witness to the relationship between the Argive and the borderlands. So on the occasion of the accession of Caligula to the throne in 37 AD, an assembly of the koinon of, I quote, you can see here, Achaeans, Boeotians, Locrians, Ebaeans, and Phocians was organized under the general name of koinon of the Hellenes or Pan-Hellenes. An Argive, we don't know his name, but we know that he was the son of Diodotos, was probably the strategos of this koinon. The assembly took place in Argos and was called a synodos. The governor of Achaia also participated. The function of this koinon has been discussed, and today we still cannot say with certainty whether it was simply a cultic organization, a sort of ancestor of the imperial cults in Achaia, or whether it had a more administrative, political, and diplomatic role to play. As Bernadette Puech pointed out, its name underlines the ambiguity of the relations it maintained with the province of Achaia. It is also in memory of, and I quote, the glory of pastimes of each of these people that the young Caligula authorized its existence. This koinon of the Pan-Hellenes or Pan-Achaeans is therefore the heir of Achaia, as it was run by Lucius Mummius and the senatorial commission. That is to say that it intends to take up an ancient Peloponnesian reality, the Achaean canon, and expand it to the whole of all Greece under Roman rulership. During this time, the change of name for the Zeus and Hera games at the beginning of the empire has also been interpreted as a desire from the Argive to assert the urban centrality of this context. In fact, the game of Zeus, which until then had been systematically referred as Nemea, were definitely renamed Nemea with a iota during the imperial period, both on local inscription referring to the Agonophaetis or on Argive coinage for the second half of the 2nd century AD, as you can see here on the slide. For Stephen Miller, the addition of an iota to the traditional name of the games marks a desire on the part of the Argive authorities to distance themselves from the extra-urban sanctuary itself. Similarly, the games of the area most often take the name of the Shield of Argos, ex Argos Aspis, from the second half of the 1st century AD. The temple of Nemea no longer had a roof at the time of Pausanias' visit under Antoninus. Excavations confirm that no major investments were made during the imperial period. Conversely, the temple of Nemean Zeus in the town of Argos was very prosperous at this time. It still houses the statue of the god sculpted by Lysippus. And Pausanias also points out that there is no statue in the temple Isis in Nemea. However, the sanctuary of Nemea continued to be visited sporadically, as evidenced by the ceramics and coins found there, as well as a graffito inscribed with the name of Martialis on the wall of the stadium tunnel during the early Roman time. Some minor improvements were carried out, such as the installation of animal restraint at the beginning of the 1st century AD and the construction of a terracotta water channel in the stadium at the end of the same century. The tombs of Hophertes and Lycurgus were still visible when Pausanias visited the site. Although games continued to be organized in Argos, the site was not entirely abandoned from a cultic point of view. Pausanias attests to the existence of a cult of those Nemeos in both Argos and Nemea, paired up with a common priest. According to him, the armed race of the winter for the Nemea was held in Nemea itself. This would imply that the competition took place in Argos, but that a small number of them were held in situ. Strabo's description of the sacred wood in which the Argive are also accustomed to celebrate the Nemea could confirm this hypothesis. If some of the competitions were held in Nemea during the imperial period, they might not have required any special equipment, as no trace of this has been found during excavation. The area was better maintained than the Nemean sanctuary. Major repairs were undertaken. A new marble roof for the temple, for example, renovation of the northeast building, for another example, as well as a reconstruction of part of the colonnade of the North Tower. New facilities were added a bathhouse is considered by early excavators to be a gymnasium and is dated by some to the 2nd century AD. During his visit, Pausanias saw numerous statues of both the goddess and her priestess. His description of the temple shows that it was in good condition at this time, with its metopes still in place, some of which were found during the excavation. Rituals were still held there. During Pausanias' visit, priestesses were still holding sacrifices there. A marble a marble sundial dedicated by a priestess of Hera, Ares Hieropolos, and dated to the 2nd century AD, has also been found at Prosimna. If Zeus of Nemea and Hera of Argo remain linked to each other in Mediterranean representation at this time, a major evolution therefore takes place at the beginning of the early Roman Empire. While until then, the fate of the 2 sanctuaries was common in Argive territorial and religious management, an asymmetry of investments appears now between the sanctuary of Nemea, partly neglected from an architectural point of view, and the Irion, which becomes the main place of memory of Argos, and maybe the center of the Argive imperial cults. The literature in Rome and in Greece now represents Nemea as a dark place, covered in mysterious forests, as in the Thebaid of Statius, composed under the reign of Domitian. Nemea is described as, I quote, the queen of the green forests, or even of the campaigns where the shepherds hardly dare to sometimes make their songs resonate. It's also known for its relationship with the wild lion defeated by Hercules. The bear sanctuary is no longer the place of interest, unlike the forest which adjoins it. Conversely, the area then served as a place of memory for the Argive and intellectual of the imperial era. First of all, it is used as a museum for the Argives. Pausanias' description is in itself revealing. The statues of divinities of heroes from the classical and Hellenistic period, for example, the ones of Grace, of Seasons, of Hebe by Nocides, adjoin the shield of Euphorbus, the ancestral bed of Hera, a silver altar, but also the statue of all ancient priestesses. The statue of Hera, sculpted at the beginning of the 4th century BC by Polykleitos the Younger, is still exhibited there, as is the archaic Zoanon of the goddess. Finally, we must add the more recent consecrations, the golden crown and the purple cloak of Nero, and the peacock of Adrian. The desire for heritage is also found in the architecture. Christopher Pfaff was able to show that certain capitals of the northern Stoa, which were thought to be from the archaic period, were in reality imitations from the imperial period. Adrian was honored as the Arian by the Argive even before he stripped Greece. A statue was already dedicated to him in the sanctuary. In addition, an inscription, a very nice inscription you can see here, discovered in Argos, tell us that a temple of Hera was destroyed by fire and that Adrian had the house restored. It was probably the Irion of Prosimna. Even the identification of this temple is debated. Specialists have wondered about the absence of a temple of the imperial cult in Argos. However, the Irion, through the consecration it received and the statues of the imperial family, could very well serve as the Argive center of this cult. There is therefore a difference in Argive investments between the 2nd century under the early empire. Nevertheless, the Argive did not particularly turn away from Nemea, which they considered as a worthy and symbolic place for the display of major religious and political decisions. In a letter to the koinon of the Panachaeans, Emperor Caligula refused the multiplication of statues dedicated to him in the province of Achaia. as a sober man. He recommends the Hellenes to be content with those, I quote, which must be dedicated only to Olympia, Nemea, Delphi, and Isthmus. Despite these clues, as I told you, no trace of such an investment was found in the excavation of the sanctuary. From the time of Augustus onwards, and throughout the first 2 centuries of the Roman Empire, there was a gradual, differentiated reinvestment in the peripheries, in the borderlands. I could not find some patterns in the current distribution for the Roman period. There are reoccupation of some sites. Do you remember, maybe you remember the sanctuary of Zeus and Hera on the Mount Arachnean between Argos and Epidavros? The ceramic shells found there show that it was reused during the Roman Empire. But there is not a total reoccupation of all these borderland sites. For example, Mycenae and its Argive sanctuaries were never reoccupied. The abandonment and the desolation of Mycenae has also become a pathos of the literature of the imperial era. The Palatine Anthology mentioned around 10 epigrams, which sing of the ancient glory of Mycenae and underline its decline. For example, Alphaeus of Mytilene, an author from the Augustan period, was surprised to see it more, I quote, more deserted than any god pasture, after having had its location pointed out by a shepherd. Antonius of Argos described it as abundant and as a solitude where gods grace. You can see also here Mundus Monatus, who had the same idea. The theme of the decline of Mycenae, like that of Troy or Corinth, was therefore conventional at the beginning of the Principate and came from the comparison between the Homeric Mycenae with the Roman one, which was an abundant village. To conclude, what can we say? That borderlands are moving spaces that cannot be defined once for all of antiquity. We must not think of them only in terms of confrontation between two cities, but also in terms of economic income, religious and ritual exchanges. However, the political factor is important, not only when it comes to conflicts, but also for the way in which the authorities choose to develop or not these spaces. Another thing for me that is very important is not to think of the limits of Greek territory in a concentric pattern from the center. You have seen sometimes Mycenae, which is very close to Argos, is abundant, while the region between Arion and Nemea is fortified. The Argives do not represent the territory in circles around Argos, but according to the roads and access to other cities, as you can see on this map for the borderland between Argos and Epidaurus. The fortification I put on the map, you can see, are not in a line, but follow the roads, in fact, between Epidaurus and Argos, in order to protect. We were also able to see that Macedonians' domination has no direct impact on the way the borderlands are managed in Argos. It is rather the establishment of a tyranny with its own interests and the constitution of the Achaean koinon as an external force, which will upset the habits of frontier management with a growing centralization of Argive cures and interests. Accession to the Achaean Confederation, to Achaean koinon, also it seems to have raised the questions of borderlands, did not modify this aspect of things. The borderlands are still underdeveloped, even if Argos still uses its territorial myth of the Heracleides, for example, with Lucius Memmius. So there are two kinds of borderlands in my head: the one we possess, but we kind of abandon, and the one we pretend should be ours. So two different representations. With the Roman Panachaean koinon, the borderlands seems to lose their political aspect as an object of fighting. We see a different treatment of extra-urban areas compared to previous centuries. While until then, the extra-urban sanctuaries were considered as parts of the same territorial vision and evolved in a very similar way, the imperial era creates a major break in the representation by fragmenting the Argive territory. But to be honest, in the absence of data, it is very difficult to go further in these conclusions. We absolutely need, in the future, to do some surveys and excavation in these borderlands. And I cannot wait for the conclusion of the Western Algorithm Regional Project, which I'm sure will be wonderful. So that's all I can say to you for right now, and I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Clemence, for this wonderful overview of the history of Argos and its borderlands, not only in the Hellenistic and Roman period, but even the classical period. You showed us a lot of sources, even for the Roman period, which are very important to understand how even the image of border and borderlands changed over time. We have time for a few questions, both online or in the room. Incoraggio anche i ragazzi e li ringrazio anche per aver seguito questa lezione che è tra le prime, no, del corso, but also online. It's no more Zoom webinar, so we changed. So you can ask your question both in the chat or live, simply by switching on your mic. So please, questions or remarks? Yes, you can also raise your hand. Well, I break the ice. I have a lot of questions, in fact, but I will limit myself.
Thank you.
One or two, and then we will have a lot of other meetings where we can have an exchange. Also,
we will see each other in June, yes.
June, for example, but even earlier maybe. I find that the idea that extra-urban sanctuaries work as a kind of border or borderland very interesting and stimulating. But you showed us, one of the first slides you showed us was about oroi, and the fact, if I correctly understood, that oroi are especially markers for sanctuaries, at least in this area, in the classical period, extra-urban sanctuaries. So I see a kind of overlapping between if oroi are markers of the territory of a sanctuary, of an extra-urban sanctuary, but this sanctuary is at the same time the marker of the border between or three different communities. How does it work? And this leads me to my second question, which is this one. Many extra-urban sanctuary revealed more and more over time their function as a meeting point for elites coming from many cities. So it's sometimes not easy to say, okay, this is the extra-urban sanctuary of this city or of another city. So how can we make this work together with the idea that the sanctuary is at the same time a kind of borderland? Thank you.
Thank you for these questions. For the first one, in fact, as I speak as sanctuary, I mean the temple, sanctuary itself, and the lands around it, which belong to the sanctuaries. What is very interesting, and I can see that for Argos, and I don't know if it's working for all the cities, is that the oroi for the sanctuary seems to have been used. For example, you can see that with the first inscription I've shown you, the one with the arbitration between maybe Arcadia and Argeia. Since the oroi, they served temporary as marked limits when there were some conflicts. That is to say that generally, I think I can see that with Argos, that the Argive don't know exactly where is the frontier, where it's a borderlands. They don't know exactly what is a frontier. But when there is a trouble, when there is an economic problem, usually, or political or military, they have to define more closely, more precisely their borders. And they will use these oroi of these sanctuaries to mark. And we saw that in this inscription I saw you from the 4th century, because we think we have 2 sanctuaries in them in this inscription. So you're totally right to say that it's not evident to know exactly what role played this oroi, but it's very complex, and it's true that it's difficult to know if they were used usually for the limits of the Argive territory. I don't think so. I think as for the fortifications, they were used sometimes when we need to use them. If not really. The principle, I always say to my students that I think that history always have to be understood with economic factors. And I'm pretty sure that, in fact, this oroi first had to mark the lands which will give some revenue to the Argives. And if there is conflict, if there is some difficulties, they will use them as landmarks. But only at this case, I think so. I don't know if I answered to your question, because
of course.
For the second one,
okay.
For the second one, I totally agree with you. It's very, very clear that sanctuary, extra-urban sanctuary are meeting points for elites and even maybe some for other people. The best example in the Argolid is the sanctuary of Apollon Pytheos in Athene. We know that Thucydides tells us that it was a meeting point for all the people in the Argolid. So for sure it was. I think when there was no pressure, when there was no conflicts, where there was no competitions, it was all these sanctuaries, even the Aryan at some points were used as meeting points. But when there were competition between 2 forces, koinon or cities, it's, I think, in this case, sanctuary can be used again as I'll say that. I don't know how to say that in English, but as a weapon, let's say, like not a weapon. It's not a good word, but can be used as an instrument to manage the territory and to say, here is my territory, and now you are no longer welcome. And the best example, sorry, it's in the classical period when Cleomenes, the Spartan, the king, came to Argos to invade Argos, and is going to the Iraean. And the Iraean, the priestess, told him, you have no right to be here. You have no right to be in my walls. You are a stranger, so you are not Argive. But in fact, we know that the Iraean was for everybody, not only for the Argives. But at this time, during these conflicts, it was forbidden for the strangers.
Thank you. There is also in the chat a remark by Roy van Wyk, who had to leave, but points out an inscription, a new inscription. You can read in the chat.
Yes.
Yeah, a new inscription.
I just wanted to point out that regarding late classical borders and border sanctuaries, there is a new inscription for Tisoa at Lycaon in the Violum by St. Martin, which mentions a Heterodocus there with regards. Ooh, interesting. I'm looking forward to meeting you in June and discussing borders more. Okay, I didn't know. I'm very interesting, and I will take a picture of it before forgetting.
Great.
So thank you if you're still here. Thank you, and I'm also waiting for our meeting.
Any more questions or remarks by those attending online or here in the room? So in that case, I'm really grateful to Clémence Weber-Pallez for this rich talk about Argos and its borderlands. And I want to invite all those attending here in the room and online to our next FeBinar, which will take place on March the 7th. It is our 10th FeBinar. It will be held by Federica Pezzoli. And the topic is exclusion from community borders, case studies from ancient Greek political thought. So many thanks again, and I hope to see you connected to our next FeBinar. Bye. Thank you,
Thank you.
Clémence,
Bye.
again.
Thank you. See you soon.